Welcome to Enform's info session video on Element C of the COR Audit Protocol, Hazard Control. In this video, we'll talk about the hierarchy of controls, the difference between engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment, controlling chemical hazards, and preventative maintenance. In the info session video on Element B, we talked about hazard identification and assessment. In a formal hazard assessment, all the hazards associated with tasks are identified. Once identified, the risks associated with each hazard is assessed and ranked. But now that you've identified and assessed hazards, what are you going to do to prevent an incident arising from those hazards? The next step then is to develop the controls for each of the hazards you identified. These need to be documented and implemented. When you implement controls, you need to assign responsibilities and follow up to ensure they work and are being applied properly. And the reason you assessed and ranked the risk for hazards is because when you develop and implement controls, you want to make sure you are most aggressive in targeting your highest ranking risks. Now, not all hazard controls are created equal. Some controls are more effective than others. As a result, you can rank controls. We call this the hierarchy of controls. Obviously, the best way to control a hazard is to eliminate it altogether. So at the top of the hierarchy of controls is elimination or substitution. You control the hazard by changing your operations in such a way that you get rid of it outright. But practically speaking, some hazards will remain in your workplace. So if you can't eliminate a hazard, the most effective control is an engineering control. If you control a hazard by physically redesigning a work process, or physically adapting, adding, or modifying equipment or tools so that you end up with a system that lowers the risk of exposure to a hazard, you've created an engineering control. So, automatic shutoff valves, deadman switches, guards, ventilation, anything that provides a physical barrier or physically prevents or removes the hazard. If it works automatically on its own without intervention, it's an engineering control. With a good engineering control, once designed and implemented, it typically shouldn't require further effort from a worker during operations, because it provides an automatic physical restraint on the hazard. It's the best choice for any hazard you cannot eliminate completely. In a perfect world, we would engineer all the hazards out of the workplace. However, that is not always feasible. This brings us to the next form of control, administrative controls. An administrative control involves creating rules, work procedures, training requirements, shift limits, checklists, or warning signs to prevent or minimize worker exposure to an identified hazard. If workers follow the directions laid out by administrative controls, they should avoid or reduce their exposure to hazards. But since there is a human decision involved, these fall below engineering controls in the hierarchy. So for example, if you have a confined space and you implement an automatic warning light that indicates gas levels are dangerously high, this would be an administrative, not an engineering control. While engineering went into the warning system, it's still just an administrative control because a human operator has to be trained in how to respond and do something to address the problem. A system that automatically removes the gas buildup, a ventilation system with an extract fan, would be an engineering control. Obviously, a system with a warning is better than one without, but you can also see why a system that does not rely on human response and decision-making is better still. At the lowest level of the hierarchy of controls is personal protective equipment, or PPE. These are well known in the oil and gas industry. Hard hats, safety glasses, fire-retardant coveralls, gloves, steel-toed rubber boots, earplugs, or muffs are often standard issue for workers. In other cases, half masks, full face shields, oil-resistant rain suits, safety harnesses, or even SCBA tanks and sealed masks are required. Sometimes it is tempting for companies to start with this last line of defense when considering hazard controls. Ideally, it should work the other way. You first try to eliminate the hazard, next design and implement an engineering control if possible, implement administrative controls if you must, and only after these have been maximized would you consider if PPE is required. Element C of the core audit is designed around this concept of the hierarchy of controls. The element starts with a series of questions that get at whether an employer is systematically addressing the hazards they have identified in their formal hazard assessment program. Have they identified controls, assigned responsibilities, followed up to measure their effectiveness, and enforce their use? The next series of questions then looks at whether the hierarchy of controls has been used in addressing hazards. It starts with engineering controls, then administrative, then PPE. The logic is that an employer should use engineering controls whenever possible. Where hazards still exist after that, administrative controls need to be implemented. And where engineering and administrative controls cannot fully control the hazard, PPE needs to be applied. Element C then deals with two components related to the topic of hazard control: preventative maintenance and hazardous materials. Preventative maintenance is an important part of a larger hazard control system. When equipment fails, new and possibly unanticipated hazards are often created. Or if the equipment is part of an engineering or administrative control or a piece of PPE, the worker is now fully exposed to the hazard. Preventative maintenance is the key to avoiding both of these outcomes. A proper preventative maintenance system will include formal maintenance scheduling, assigned responsibilities with accountability, as well as records and reports that track maintenance activities. The frequency and type of maintenance required will be based on two standards: government regulations and manufacturer specifications wherever these apply. Preventative maintenance is not itself a hazard control, but it is key to an employer's hazard controls working as designed. The last set of questions in Element C has to do with hazardous materials. Don't think of this as off by itself and unique. You deal with hazardous materials using the same hierarchy of controls as you do with any hazard. The difference is that there are set workplace regulations concerning the administrative controls you must have in place. You are more than likely already familiar with terms like WMIS and MSDS. Employers are required to ensure all WMIS-controlled products are properly identified and labeled. This includes information on the safe handling, storage, and use of the product. In addition, employers must supply their employees with material safety data sheets, or MSDSs, for each controlled product they use in their workplace. And employers are responsible to provide their employees with education and training related to the WMIS. The audit questions look at whether an employer has fulfilled their WMIS-related responsibilities. Again, this is an example of applying an administrative control to an identified hazard, namely chemical exposure. In addition to the WMIS requirements, the audit also asks if there's a plan to control exposure to hazardous waste and infectious substances. Again, an example of an administrative control. So to recap, every hazard identified in a company's formal hazard assessment must be controlled, beginning with those that ranked as the highest risk level. Controls need to be assigned, and there must be follow-up, evaluation, and enforcement of these controls. Controls need to be developed in accordance with the hierarchy of controls, which means that if you can't fully eliminate a hazard, you start by trying to apply an engineering control. If that is not possible, you move to administrative controls. And only after those have been fully considered and developed, you apply PPE as a hazard control. Preventative maintenance is a key component in any company's hazard control program, since malfunctioning equipment can introduce new hazards or leave workers more exposed to existing hazards. Managing hazardous materials needs to take into account WMIS requirements, which are really a form of administrative control for known chemical hazards. Remember, as with hazard assessment, companies will create systems using terminology that makes sense for their operations. As auditors, it is important that you understand the concepts behind hazard control. Understand the concept, and you'll be able to evaluate your client's hazard control systems quickly and accurately. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to check back for more info session videos on other Enform COR related topics.